Hello, everyone. I'm delighted to welcome you all here in person and online to the Center for Global Development for this conversation with Jay Shambaugh, Under Secretary for International Affairs at the U.S. Treasury. I'm Nancy Lee, Director for Sustainable Development Finance here at CGD. Jay's topic here today is Treasury's vision for the IMF. As you know, the subject of transforming the multilateral development banks to meet global challenges has been front and center in summits, in the G20, at COP, and in other fora. The IMF, somewhat surprisingly, has thus far not received as much attention. Yet its financial firepower, that is, its lending capacity, was assessed at over $900 billion as of in June of this year. And traditionally, it's been the IMF that has played the part in the international financial architecture in leading in responding to financial and economic challenges and crises. We have no shortage of crises at the moment. So our need for a proactive and fit-for-purpose IMF, I would argue, has never been greater. So we commend Jay and Treasury's broadening of the spotlight on international financial institutions to include the IMF as well as the multilateral development banks. And I'm personally very pleased to welcome Jay. He may demur, but let me categorically state my conviction that there is no more important job on the planet if you're interested in helping to shape international economic and financial policy and institutions. Jay fits well in the illustrious pantheon of his predecessors, some of whom have actually gone on to be secretaries of the Treasury. He was a member of the White House Council of Economic Advisors, director of the Hamilton Project at the Brookings Institution, and he's a professor of economics and international affairs at George Washington University. Treasury, the U.S., and the world are fortunate to have him in this critical job at this critical time, and we're very fortunate to have him here at the Center for Global Development today. Jay will speak for about 30 minutes, then I'll take the opportunity to pose a few questions, but then I will turn to you to bring you into the conversation, so be thinking and formulating your questions, and we will also take questions from our quite large online audience. You can tweet at CGD Talks, you can email events@cgd.org, or you can leave a question on the events YouTube page. So without further ado, Jay, let me welcome you to the podium.
Thank you, Nancy, for that very kind introduction. And thank you to the Center for Global Development for hosting me here today. Our meeting comes really at an important moment for the international financial architecture. It was roughly 1 year ago that Secretary Yellen stood right here at CGD and shared her ideas on development finance. She issued an urgent call for the evolution of the multilateral development bank system, for bold action to meet the challenges of the 21st century. The United States led this call, and we're very proud to be part of a broad coalition with fellow shareholders and MDB management and staff so that this evolution agenda can deliver in tangible ways for emerging markets and developing countries. And as Nancy said, today I want to focus on the IMF to kind of complete this picture of how the Treasury Department sees the international financial institutions delivering for emerging markets and developing countries. I want to share my vision for the IMF and discuss how we think it can be strengthened to meet the challenges of the global economy. So since its founding, the U.S. has strongly supported the IMF, both for the good of the world and because we have recognized that we benefit from greater growth and economic stability in the rest of the world. Stronger economies abroad and sound policy advice from a high standards international organization can help raise living standards around the world, and that's very much in the U.S. national interest. So It was established in 1944 in the wake of the Great Depression and Second World War, and since then, at that time, the IMF was charged with overseeing the international monetary system and to help maintain exchange rate stability and support global growth. So now, decades later, the fixed exchange rate system that was founded under Bretton Woods has long since gone away, and it's given way to new exchange rate arrangements, and the IMF has adapted its role and its policy advice to fulfill its mandate of overseeing the stability of the international monetary system. It helps monitor exchange rate developments, guides countries through challenging macroeconomic issues, and works to facilitate financial stability and economic growth. The IMF has been an invaluable and really indispensable partner. Time and again, the IMF has adapted to the needs of the moment without shying away from undertaking institutional reforms to make it fit for purpose. It is as essential today as it was at its founding, and even if it did not exist, we would need something like it nonetheless. And this is why we're making a commitment to reinvest in the IMF. This year, we will support an increase in quotas for a broad increase across all members, with the goal of strengthening the IMF as a shareholder institution at the core of the global financial safety net. We're pressing forward to meet the financing needs of the Poverty Reduction and Growth Trust so that the IMF can continue to lend to low-income countries now and into the future. We want to work with the IMF shareholders and management on ways to elevate the voices of emerging market and developing countries. And really, we want the IMF to deliver on its core mandate of surveillance, capacity development, and lending, and demonstrate a strong track record in guiding countries back onto sustainable macroeconomic trajectories. We also need the IMF to play its role in an unflinching and rigorous way so that countries make needed adjustments to bring their economies to sound footing. No other institution really can provide macroeconomic guidance along with funding to steer countries to better macro outcomes. So, let me set the current context. Our discussion comes on the back of two massive global shocks: the loss of life and economic disruption from the COVID-19 pandemic, and the destruction, elevated energy and food prices, and other spillovers from Russia's illegal and immoral war against Ukraine. For emerging market and developing countries, the impact of these shocks has been especially severe. First came the immense fiscal needs to support individuals and families during the pandemic. Then Russia's war against Ukraine led to spikes in commodity prices, putting further pressure on public finances and creating food insecurity for many. Heightened debt vulnerabilities and tighter financial market conditions limited access to international capital markets as well. So the IMF responded quickly and forcefully to these shocks. It tailored its lending toolkit to provide emergency financing at an unprecedented scale to countries facing acute economic downturns. It stood up new facilities to meet growing balance of payments pressures from the food crisis and mounting transboundary challenges such as climate change. And it has played a key role in implementing the G20-led initiatives on debt service suspension and debt relief, including by co-chairing the Global Sovereign Debt Roundtable to address key bottlenecks in the debt restructuring process. The IMF is full of incredibly talented people who can contribute positively to a wide range of challenges facing the global economy. But we can't let the temptation to address every problem pull the IMF away from its core mission of macroeconomic and exchange rate surveillance and guidance. That mission is just too essential to stray from. Often the IMF can best contribute to new challenges through its core mission. So you could take climate as an example. Through strong macro guidance, the IMF can help countries undertake fiscal reforms to reduce distortionary energy subsidies that also have bad climate outcomes. It can help countries strengthen their macroeconomic frameworks so they can return to market access and better mobilize private capital to invest in climate-resilient infrastructure. Through capacity development, it can help countries better raise revenue, which is obviously crucial for macro stability, but it's also an essential part of both climate mitigation and adaptation. When climate risks present a balance of payments strain, the IMF can provide lending, for example, via the Resilience and Sustainability Trust. At the same time, the IMF should not be experts on climate. Instead, it should focus on the macro-critical issues and rely on the World Bank and others for the sectoral experience. In short, solving the world's major problems and major challenges should involve reinforcing the core mandate, not straying from it. So, in this context, I'd like to lay out 3 priorities for the IMF. First, in our view, the IMF must provide sound, even-handed policy advice to all members in its core areas of expertise, particularly fiscal, monetary, and financial sector issues. Surveillance is one of the IMF's core tools to provide this policy advice. The IMF regularly monitors the economic and financial developments and policies of its members bilaterally and globally. This work is crucial for revealing systemic risks and vulnerabilities, both within member countries and with respect to the global economy before they turn into crises. And it helps countries identify the right policy mix to achieve its economic objectives. Debt overhang remains one of the most significant economic headwinds for many countries, and many low-income countries are confronting difficult policy trade-offs to strengthen their fiscal positions to support debt sustainability while still achieving progress on sustainable development goals and addressing economic challenges posed by climate change. The IMF offers invaluable advice, including through its rigorous debt sustainability analysis framework. The IMF must be candid in this effort. It must be willing to have difficult conversations with member countries, especially when there are downside risks or policies that could have adverse spillovers to the global economy. It must be willing to provide unwelcome advice. This includes calling out harmful external sector policies and exchange rate regimes that distort the domestic economy and push the cost of adjustment onto trading partners. From its founding, the IMF has been charged with monitoring exchange rates and considering how policies in one country spill over across the globe. The IMF must be clear when countries violate these norms. The widespread belief that a major shareholder intervenes in opaque ways flies in the face of what the IMF is supposed to be. The IMF must urge members to adopt best practices such as transparency on foreign exchange rate intervention. IMF advice should address balance sheet vulnerabilities that could pose systemic financial stability risks. This should also mean advocating for difficult policy corrections that pay dividends over time, including pressing countries to address governance or corruption issues that really can squander resources and limit growth. We all have a stake in making sure that surveillance remains front and center at the IMF's mission and that it offers effective policy advice for its entire membership, both big and small countries. The IMF's new strategy for fragile and conflict-affected states is one example where the institution has stepped up to meet members' needs. The strategy builds on the IMF's longstanding experience with fragile and conflict-affected states to provide more robust, more tailored approaches to reflect the country-specific fragility context. The IMF's work on AML-CFT, or anti-money laundering and countering the finance of terrorism, is another example where the IMF provides policy advice on macro-critical issues. Effective implementation of AML-CFT regimes is essential to the integrity and stability of the international financial system, global growth, and the rule of law. IMF surveillance is critical not only for individual countries, but for the global system. Excuse me. For surveillance to be most effective, it should also be transparent, and here the IMF has made significant strides over the past few decades. The IMF publishes detailed information on country data, financial membership, and executive board decisions, and we welcome the IMF's ongoing efforts to boost transparency. We urge the IMF to press for greater transparency on exchange rates, on borrowing and lending, and on financial system data. Second, the IMF must continue to advance its work on capacity development. Robust capacity development, paired where needed with programs, can help countries establish sustainable medium-term macroeconomic frameworks. IMF surveillance and lending relies on understanding of a country's economy, which depends at its core on data quality and availability. And the IMF needs to uphold its rigorous data standards for surveillance, supported by valuable technical assistance to member countries to improve data gathering quality and transparency. Capacity development has helped countries to strengthen their economic institutions and facilitate stronger macroeconomic policymaking. This includes the IMF's critical work in helping countries bolster public finances, modernize their monetary and exchange rate regimes, and strengthen governance and anti-corruption efforts. Over the years, the IMF has expanded access to advice, peer-to-peer learning, and trainings with country authorities, excuse me, which we value and welcome. The IMF's assistance is increasingly needed, for example, in the remote reaches of the Pacific Islands in areas such as public financial management, taking into account the impact of climate change, and financial supervision and regulation as the loss of correspondent bank relationships threaten connectivity to the international financial system. Third, the IMF must create and sustain high-quality lending programs. So the IMF's most public-facing role is that of crisis response. When countries experience balance of payments crises, the IMF provides financing at reasonable rates to smooth over immediate liquidity needs. It provides the financial space that countries need to implement reform programs and helping them avoid choices that could exacerbate financial stresses or inequality. And an appropriately designed IMF program with strong policy credibility can help catalyze financial flows over time from other parties, particularly from the private sector. In response to the pandemic and Russia's war against Ukraine, the IMF scaled up emergency financing to help countries in a time of crisis to weather these acute exogenous shocks. This lending helps not just the individual members, but the global economy as well. As countries look toward recovery, we're encouraged that more countries are transitioning away from emergency financing assistance and instead are seeking high-quality programs. These programs must be accompanied by policy reforms that restore economic stability with an eye toward sustainable growth. The IMF must embrace its role and help countries correct underlying macroeconomic imbalances. It must promote policies that support fiscal and debt sustainability, address exchange rate misalignment, and strengthen structural reforms to catalyze sustainable and inclusive growth. The IMF must work closely with countries' fiscal and monetary authorities to identify the macroeconomic reforms needed to achieve economic objectives. And once they do, the IMF must stay steadfast in its advice. To be effective, the IMF must be willing to walk away if a country will not take needed steps. It's essential that programs not just provide funding. The funding must serve a purpose and come with policies that return a country to stability over time. A program with insufficient adjustment will just leave the country back in the same or worse economic position, often with more debt. And if a program lacks credibility, it can't realistically bring new private financing along with it. We rely on the IMF to help countries emerge from a crisis better than where they were before. And so to this end, traditional programs that help countries resolve immediate balance of payments problems should be temporary in nature. IMF programs are structured to provide temporary financing in response to acute crises. And the revolving nature of IMF financing is intrinsic to the IMF's mandate. We want to see an IMF where countries seek assistance from the IMF and then emerge from programs better than they were before, on stable economic footing. We know, though, that some countries, in particular open emerging markets, can face external shocks that may overwhelm even robust macroeconomic frameworks. And so for countries that meet the highest standards of economic policy and governance, the IMF's flexible credit line can offer additional reserve coverage to bolster the strength of independent central banks. So credibility is also at stake. We expect the IMF to play a catalytic role in helping countries regain market access. This requires the IMF to quickly step into crisis situations with substantial financing backed by macroeconomic adjustment and robust reforms. We must do what we can to bolster the IMF's track record, and that might mean making difficult decisions with members. We understand that in some cases, a country will require follow-on programs to resolve balance of payments problems. But repeated programs that merely roll over IMF debt without policy reforms that restore sustainability and improve the lives of country citizens only worsen the debt situation of a country, waste finite shareholder resources, and harm the credibility of the IMF. In these moments, the IMF must be willing to hold firm on policy adjustments that are necessary. We recognize that this is not an easy task to expect of an institution that exists to help its members through temporary shocks, as well as more protracted constraints on growth. And we can't be cavalier about the difficulties of advising national authorities in an apolitical manner on policy choices that are intrinsically political. But it can't be the policy of the IMF to roll over programs or approve reviews only to avoid arrears without sound policy reforms in place. So we ask so much of the IMF because there's simply no other institution that can fill its role in the global financial system. For the IMF to play this role across areas of surveillance, capacity development, and lending, it needs to be responsive to the needs of its membership. It must strive to be a reliable partner to countries can turn to in times of crisis, and this will mean implementing policy reforms where needed and seeking opportunities to better reflect the voices of its membership. And I'd like to conclude by laying out how the U.S. Treasury believes we could strengthen the IMF. First, we must make sure the IMF has the resources it needs to lend. So we see a pressing need to bolster the finances of the IMF's flagship trusts that tackle poverty and build resilience, and we will continue to work with our Congress to do so. The Poverty Reduction and Growth Trust, or PRGT, is the IMF's concessional financing facility for eligible low-income countries. For the poorest PRGT-eligible members, the interest rate is currently 0%. The IMF's new Resilience and Sustainability Trust, or RST, is intended to address balance of payments risks from longer-term macroeconomic challenges such as climate change or pandemics and help countries build resilience when paired with traditional IMF programs underpinning strong policies. 10 countries have already benefited from the RST and demand is strong. The U.S. contributed $70 million to the PRGT subsidy account last year, and the Biden administration continues to call on Congress to authorize the United States to lend $21 billion to the IMF for the PRGT and RST. But in light of higher lending in the wake of the pandemic and Russia's war against Ukraine, PRGT resources are falling short, particularly subsidy resources needed to sustain the PRGT's interest-free lending. IF management are urgently calling for additional pledges of $1.2 billion for subsidy resources, and although donor resources can help to meet the immediate need, putting the subsidy account on a sustainable footing will require further action. And this is why Secretary Yellen and I have called on the IMF to table options by the time of the annual meetings next month to close the longer-term financing gap so the IMF can continue to provide concessional lending now and into the future. One idea we think the IMF should consider is using its internally generated resources to support the PRGT subsidy account. This is a way for the entire membership of the IMF to show its strong support for its most vulnerable members. In the near term, the IMF could fill a majority of the PRGT subsidy gap through a distribution and transfer of internal resources from the IMF's reserves, while still maintaining a very strong buffer of precautionary resources due to the recent uptick in lending. Second, we strongly support making the IMF a more quota-based institution through an equiproportional increase in quotas and increases that is allocated to all members in proportion to their existing shares, combined with corresponding decline in the IMF's borrowed resources. So quotas are core to the IMF. They determine members' voting power and access to IMF financing. An equiproportional quota increase that restores the IMF as a quota-based institution will reduce its reliance on borrowed resources and provide the IMF with a more consistent and predictable level of resources. It would safeguard the IMF's role at the center of the global financial safety net, and it could raise borrowing access for low-income countries, allowing for larger IMF programs when needed and consistent with their debt sustainability. It would also remove the need for the IMF to set up ad hoc bilateral borrowing arrangements that are opaque and a less reliable source of financing. The United States will continue to advocate for changes to the quota formula to make it more reflective of the global economy, including by giving more weight to dynamic emerging markets. And an important part of that process will be that all countries, especially those that would see an increase in their share, are respecting the roles and norms of the IMF and working to strengthen the international monetary system. And so we look forward to working with other countries over time on a new quota formula that ensures all voices are heard in the process. Changing shares without an agreed framework, though, would result in upweighting a handful of countries at the expense of many others in an ad hoc manner. Third, we must work together to make sure the IMF represents its diverse membership. As emerging market and developing countries have become an increasingly significant part of the global economy, they've called for increasing their representation at the IMF. Absent a durable change in quota shares, we think more could be done to elevate the voices of these countries. In particular, it's my view that senior management should be more representative of the membership they serve. So one way to do this would be to add a fifth deputy managing director position. For over a decade, the IMF senior leadership has had 4 deputy managing directors. One of those positions traditionally has been held, the first deputy position has been traditionally held by the United States. One position has traditionally been held by Japan. One has traditionally been held by China. And then that has left 1 seat for everybody else, all emerging and developing countries combined. Adding a new slot would help to broaden the perspectives of the IMF senior leadership team. If designed well, it could mean that at all times, both emerging markets and low-income countries would have a voice at the most senior level of the fund. Stronger representation could also mean strengthening the voice of emerging markets and developing countries at the IMF Executive Board. To that end, we're open to engaging with sub-Saharan African members on whether they would find value in the creation of a 25th chair at the board that would provide a 3rd chair for sub-Saharan Africa. For other policies, our priority, frankly, is to listen, whatever the issue. An example here is surcharge policy. We're open to hearing views on surcharge policy reform that balance the needs to address members' concerns and the objective of adequately protecting the IMF's balance sheet and incentivizing the short-term nature of IMF finance. So the IMF has been an important anchor for the global financial system, and we need to make sure it can continue to play that role. Shocks will hit countries, especially the most vulnerable, and the IMF must stand ready to support countries in their immediate response and to help countries build resilience to future shocks. The world needs the IMF to be a trusted voice, one that comes through with policy advice and resources, but also one that provides the tough advice needed to steer policy back to a sound footing. Though I conclude my opening remarks here, I really view this as the start of many conversations. I invite the international community, particularly emerging markets and developing countries and the IMF management and staff, to partner with the United States to drive these reforms forward. Over the last year, the United States has worked closely with a range of country partners and with World Bank management to push the MDB evolution agenda forward. And this is already delivering tangible results in how the bank operates and the resources it can use to better support emerging market and developing countries. And now is the time to show how the United States supports emerging market and developing countries at the IMF as well. There's a lot more work to do, and I look forward to tackling those challenges together. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Jay. That was, first of all, a model of clarity, and second, really comprehensive in terms of your vision of the role of the IMF and how it should evolve. So maybe the most useful thing we can do in this initial conversation is to drill down a little bit into the evolution part of the IMF as opposed to what needs to stay the same. So let me start with quite a broad question. I think it can be argued pretty convincingly that the nature of the shocks that countries are experiencing in this century are in many cases, not all cases, but in many cases quite different than the shocks that the IMF has traditionally responded to. The traditional role of the IMF has been to help countries respond to shocks that often are sourced within the country itself, quite often traditionally by a policy failure, a set of macroeconomic policy failures inside the country. In this century, I think you can argue that many of the shocks are external in their source. You mentioned them, pandemics, the very real effects now of climate change, commodity price shocks, and wars, and the wider implication of those wars. So if the nature of the shocks has changed, would you say that that has implications for the nature of the response, the IMF response, particularly its programs, the terms of its programs, maybe even its policy conditionality in a world where not investing in resilience has risk, as well as the notion of too much fiscal spending? So we're in a different world. How do you think that, what are the implications for what the IMF does and how it does it?
No, I think it's a great question. I mean, I think I would say on the one hand, while I agree with you, I mean, there have always been big external shocks, and that has been part of what the IMF has always been responding to. And I think you're right that often it was also responding to what we might think of as more self-inflicted shocks from policy. And, you know, unfortunately, those still exist as well. And so I think that aspect of the IMF's guidance and macroeconomic frameworks that it comes in with are still really important, because I think at the end of the day, without a strong base of sound macroeconomic policy, it's just going to be hard for countries to accomplish much beyond that. So with that as kind of a home base, I think then you can say that, you know, there have been countries that have faced shocks that you would sit there and say, boy, they had great macro policy frameworks, they were doing everything right, and then they just got kind of steamrolled here. And I think in cases like that, you know, what you find is that can mean the policy conditionality, if you will, winds up not being that radical, right? It's come in and you just need to keep the frameworks that you have in place, and you need a temporary balance of payments smoothing over kind of thing. But I think it also has suggested the IMF has itself come forward and said, you know, we need some different things available. And so I think we have seen that on the one hand of just very short-term things like the food shock window, of just saying there are a bunch of countries getting just completely crushed by the 1-2 punch of COVID and then Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And we're not going to go in with a huge amount of policy conditionality here. We're just going to say in the countries that have faced negative food shocks should have access to some emergency financing. So I think that's one case where it innovated relatively on the fly. Management worked hard on it. The executive board worked with management, and we stood up something that was then able to help some countries. I think the Resilience and Sustainability Trust is the other example, more to the longer term questions you're asking, where maybe the shocks a country are facing are going to require something that's going to be an investment that is not a short-term thing to kind of get in and get out of IMF funding, but is going to require funding over a decade to do a much bigger investment in something. And I think that's the point of the RST, is to say, if you have a sound macro policy framework in place, we can, and if either responding to pandemics or climate are going to require some sort of investment that'll have a negative balance of payments impact over time, here's access to very cheap, longer-term financing to let you try to make those investments. So I think that's the goal, is for them to evolve.
Yeah, okay, that's very clear. Do you see, just to ask specifically about precautionary programs, do you see any implications in how precautionary programs are framed and offered that also respond to this, particularly for countries with the strong fundamentals that you...
I mean, I think so. The precautionary programs is one thing that I didn't mention much in this speech, except to kind of note that they exist and we understand why they exist and they're important. But it's something the fund is currently working with the board to kind of renovate the programs, and it's something else that I think we'll probably see more come out in Marrakesh at the annual meetings. So I think it's another thing of recognizing, okay, this is something that's existed for a while. Let's retool it a little bit. Let's make sure the rules are clear to everybody, what it requires to kind of have them say, yes, this is like platinum level macro framework and central bank independence, and this is a country that doesn't need the funding today, but we recognize to be a small open economy might need the funding if it gets hit by a shock. And so we want to make sure that funding is, everybody knows the funding is sitting there if needed. So I think that's another thing that the IMF is trying to work with membership, in particular the countries that see these as tools they want, to figure out, well, what is it about the way they exist today that works for you? What doesn't? How can we make sure these work in a way that's responsible for the fund, but also encourages good behavior by countries and not kind of helps them backslide on policy issues, things like that.
Yeah, I think that's particularly important now as we go through the next period where there's sort of lots of potential for turmoil in global capital flows, and including for countries that are pretty well situated in terms of their macroeconomic policy. So I'm glad to hear that that's on the agenda. So let's go to the size question.
Yeah.
A couple of questions. So you were very clear on U.S. support for a quota increase. You also very clear that the United States supports changes in the quota formula to be more reflective of the global economy through an inclusive consultative process. And you made an important link between any country's increase in quota share and its respect for what you called a strengthened international monetary system and the IMF role in such a strengthened system. So that's an important link. So I wanted to get a sense from you of what does that look like? So what are the elements you would be looking for from the countries that would benefit from a change in the quota formula in terms of support for a strengthened monetary system and the IMF role?
It's a great question, and so I mean I think on the one hand, when we say we're supportive of the new quota formula, I should say one thing: we recognize that's not going to happen between now and the annual meetings, right? And that's why we've also said we think in the meantime we should just do an equiproportional increase in quota to get the IMF the resources it needs now, and work towards a new quota formula over time that would change things. So it's not something where we would need like a list of things countries would need to change immediately. It's more reflective of how countries would operate over the next few years. I think part of that is, when we look at transparency, transparency in lending, I think is crucial. I think we all know that watching countries try to dig out from debt distress, one of the hardest things is when there's opaque lending involved. So I think countries having high standards lending, where the lending is done in a way that is highly transparent to make it easier to unwind problems, operating well within debt restructuring frameworks and coming together in countries don't have to be a member of the Paris Club, but working together globally to make sure we can deal with countries. I think there is a mountain of research that has been written about how once a country is in debt distress, the faster you get them out of debt distress, it's better for everybody, both the creditors and the debtors. Mm-hmm. And so trying to say that's part of playing by the rules of the game, as it were. Part of the rules of the game are if you're doing a lot of lending, you need to recognize when that lending has gone bad and work globally to get a country out of that position. So I think those issues around debt are important. I would also say issues around, the fund, as much as it does many, many, many things, at the end of the day, the fund was created for exchange rates. And I think transparency around exchange rate intervention, transparency around how you manage your exchange rate are still core norms that the fund needs to uphold. So I would say those are the types of things you would want to see all members working towards, and making that clear as part of a quota formula change, that these are the things we're hopeful that all major shareholders of the fund are doing.
Very clear. So let's talk a little bit about another aspect of sort of resource availability, which is the global SDR allocation. Mm-hmm. $650 billion. It was clearly valuable for many vulnerable low-income countries as well as middle-income countries. But as has been said many times, most of it sits on the balance sheets of the advanced countries with large quota shares.
Yes.
Lots of discussion of SDR recycling, but the reality is it's been slow, and that even includes the pledges, the advanced country pledges for reallocations to the RST and the PRGT that you mentioned. And from what we can tell, less than $1 billion has actually been dispersed through recycling. So that sort of raises the broader question of whether SDR allocations should be re-examined, and whether there should be a change in that process to make it sort of a more scalable safety net and a more agile safety net for the countries that need boosts in reserves most. So how do you think about SDR allocations going forward?
So I'd say a few things. First, on rechanneling, I would just say, I think the billion is talking about RST money that's gone out the door. I think more has been committed. It just hasn't actually been
Gone out the door.
put out the door. But then there's also a lot of recycling that went through the PRGT as well. And so I think there it's harder to trace exactly what was recycled money versus not. So I think it doesn't get counted. But I think the money that countries have put into the PRGT is also incredibly important and has helped make sure the PRGT has been able to do as much lending as it's done over the last 2 years. And certainly when the US, we don't think of it as an SDR rechanneling, we think of it as a lending resources question, and that the countries that got an SDR allocation should lend resources, whatever form that takes. For some countries, budgetarily, SDRs is what works. For us, just lending dollars budgetarily works just as easily, and so that's what we're trying to do. But for us, it would be lending to both RST and PRGT, because we think that resources going to PRGT is so important there. But in terms of then what would that mean going forward? I think one thing I would say is I think the major SDR allocation that took place in a very unique moment where I think everyone, policymaker-wise, were very worried about global liquidity. Right? And there was a question, do we have enough global liquidity around? And the answer was, we're afraid we don't. We don't want to have a huge shortfall in crisis, and therefore the thing to do is pump liquidity into the international monetary system. I don't think that's where we are now. I think where we are now is much more there are individual countries who need a lot of resources and support. It's not clear to me an SDR allocation is the way you manage that as much as using the tools we have effectively, whether it's lending from the fund, lending from the MDB system, mobilizing private sector capital, mobilizing domestic resources. It feels like those are the tools we have and should be using today, I think is the way I would frame it.
Okay. So you're not, things like regular SDR allocations or sort of allocations with not completely tied to quotas, you don't think this is the time to be thinking about those?
I don't think we're thinking of an SDR allocation regardless of form as the immediate answer to problems we face today.
Okay. So I'm going to ask one more question. So I'm going to be then turning to you all to jump into the conversation. And it's picking up on this point, the RST point in particular, and then the broader context of the IMF versus the multilateral development banks. So the RST clearly gets the IMF into the world of longer-term finance for longer-term resilience and mitigation investments that have both budget and balanced payments implications.
Yep.
That's a world that very much overlaps with the MDB world.
Yeah.
So, so what do you think about the division of labor? So, if we have the IMF and the set of MDBs, and they're starting to overlap, what should the IMF, what's the comparative of the IMF and what it should focus on versus the MDBs, and how do we avoid a situation where they're sort of duplicating or colliding with each other in an unproductive fashion?
It's an incredibly important question. These two institutions and two buildings sit right across the street from each other, actually connected by a parking garage. So they are right there together and have been sister institutions forever, but understanding the lines more than just that road is important. And I think what we've been trying to advocate is that the IMF's comparative advantage unabashedly is macro policy. And that's where you want the IMF spending most of its time. And the idea is that because climate and investing to deal with pandemics and public health are such big investments, kind of as you said at the start, right? That might require a different type of investment from the IMF, not just short-term lending, trying to get in and get out. That doesn't mean the IMF should be doing projects or should be doing programming. It's more that when a country is making these investments kind of as part of something else, that the IMF then comes in a role saying, wow, these investments are going to have macro critical impacts. These investments are going to have balanced payments impacts and budget impacts that are going to last for a while. And bringing in very low cost, because it is very low cost, IMF financing on a longer tenor is one way the IMF can be supportive in that role. And so I think that's what the IMF can be doing, whereas the World Bank is obviously projects, long-term growth strategies, involved in a much different way in what the countries are thinking long-term. I think what we've seen, and I do think this is honestly one of the reasons it took a little while longer for money to come out of the RSD. I mean, in fairness, it didn't start until 2022, so it's it's pretty young. But I think one of the key things was figuring out how to partner and how to use the CCDRs at the World Bank, the Country Climate Development Reports, to think through how can the fund leverage the work that's taking place at the bank and let the bank do what the bank does in that kind of work, and then bring the IMF in as a partner, as opposed to have the IMF duplicate or replicate what the World Bank is doing, which would not be a good use of anybody's time, I think would be our view.
Yeah, no, I'm glad you mentioned the country climate and development reports, because that's a knowledge asset.
Exactly.
Hopefully it can be shared across MDBs, and certainly should not be reproduced with a competing.
Yes, very much agree with that.
IMF
And fortunately, I think the fund agrees with that. Right?
Yeah.
They have understood that partnering and using these CCDRs is how they can play a useful role.
Yeah.
I mean, as I said before, I mean, I think it plays lots of other useful roles on climate, because so much of what it does matters, in the sense of, like, I really think domestic resource mobilization is a great example. Whenever we talk about how much money needs to go to climate, a huge part is always assumed to be domestic resources. There are a lot of countries that really struggle with domestic resource mobilization, and that is a core issue for the fund, because it's macro critical. Getting countries in a better place there winds up having big impacts on climate as well. But that's by doing the core mandate, where you want the fund really spending their time.
Yeah, got it. Okay, so, I'm so glad to see a hand shoot up immediately. Let's take a few questions from the audience, and then we'll go to the online audience. Please, if you could just identify yourself and ask your question.
Stanley Kober, fellow Fletcher alum with Dr. Shambaugh. One word I see in IMF reports I didn't hear today: fragmentation. The IMF is concerned about fragmentation. We use euphemisms: de-risking, resilience, but it's fragmentation. As I look at the historical precedents, fragmentation leads to ominous developments. This wasn't what we expected when the Berlin Wall came down. Where do you think this fragmentation will lead?
So I guess what I would say is, I think you're right. It's something that has shown up in IMF reports, and I didn't mention it today. I think our view is that there actually is a very big difference between diversification or de-risking and fragmentation. I think those are two very different things. I think if you think of fragmentation as the amount of global trade going down and the world dividing into two blocks where there's no connectivity, that's the kind of thing the IMF has been writing reports saying what that would lead to in terms of output loss and losses for countries. And I would agree with them that that would be a very bad outcome, and one that would have bad macroeconomic outcomes. I think where we would disagree is that that's anything we're trending towards. And I think as people have looked at the data recently, what you see, there was a paper presented at Jackson Hole just a couple of weeks ago that I thought did a very nice job demonstrating this, by Laura Alfaro and a co-author, showing that what they called more the great reallocation, that you're seeing, there was a very, very, very large degree of concentration of some supply chains just running out of one country. And that probably wasn't the soundest way to do things, just from a broad economic perspective, valuing diversification. And I think what we've seen is a lot more diversification. It's not something that is necessarily policy driven. I think part of it is honestly just, as China gets richer, some activity is going to move. We saw this with Japan between 1985 and 95. Exports that used to go straight to the United States started going to East Asia, and then from East Asia to the United States. And so the notion that you would see a similar process is not surprising. And the notion that, frankly, countries might want to encourage that process to get more diversification, I think makes sense. I think that's a very different thing than like pure fragmentation and dividing the world into two groups, which I don't see that as a direction that we in the United States government are trying to drive at all. And I think Secretary Yellen has tried to make that clear in no uncertain terms as often as she can by saying we don't see decoupling as in our interest. It is not something we are trying to drive or achieve.
Thanks. Rob.
Thank you very much for your presentation. I'm Rob Mosbacher. I serve on the Development Advisory Council at the DFC. So my question is not about the IMF. But there's a growing consensus, I believe, among not only DFIs and MDBs, but also among all of us that watch them, that they all need to start taking much more risk to start to reduce the funding gap. And the Secretary's been very clear on that. My question is, what else are you doing, or what else can you do? For instance, what sort of guidance can you give to REDs at some of these institutions to push those institutions to truly look differently at risk-taking?
I think it's a great question. I think the reality is doing the steering just from the ED seat or voting on particular loans is probably not where you're going to see the most traction. And I think instead it's when people kind of tick through the MDB evolution agenda, there are, traditionally kind of 4 buckets they put things into, and I think people have kind of focused on the first and the fourth, the first being the mission, and so people, I think, have understood that we're talking about bringing in global challenges because they have such a big impact on both poverty reduction and sustainable development that you can't accomplish those core goals without dealing with the global challenges. And the kind of the last bucket, which is resources. People understand that. They can sit there and say, oh, hey, the reforms in April unlocked $50 billion in headroom to the IMF, to the World Bank. Everybody can say that number. And they can talk about the mission. The middle ones that are much more operational, how are we changing the operational incentives within the bank and in how the bank operates? That's, I think, more what you're talking about. And that is something where there is work going on right now. Believe me, like this is what people are working very hard on, is this kind of messy work inside the institutions to say, how do we make sure the people who are doing the programming, the country directors, the people who are working on the ground are shifting their mindset in terms of what exactly an MDB loan should look like. And so I think that is the work that's taking place right now. It's not easy because risk is risk. Just, it exists somewhere. And so we can't just pretend that the public balance sheet can take it on and it's done, because then the public balance sheet has the risk. It doesn't make it go away. But trying to make sure we're smart about how we're doing it is important. It's something that I know new World Bank President Ajay Banga feels very strongly about, is how are we going to partner the MDBs with the private sector? How are we going to mobilize the private sector? And part of that is adjusting what risk the MDBs are taking versus the private sector is taking and how they're partnering together better. So I think we have people in place working very hard on it, and I agree with you, it's an important challenge.
Glad to hear it. Let's take a few questions from the online audience, and then maybe if we have time, we can come back to the in-person audience. This is our colleague Samuel Matthews. Samuel.
The first online question comes from Joe Ryan. Should the IMF establish a protocol for supporting small members in adopting a global reserve currency? For example, the way that El Salvador adopted the US dollar in 2001.
So I think, in some sense, the fund does have a global reserve currency, which is SDRs, right? Like, so it's not something. Now the thing is, then you need to convert those SDRs into something to use it, and I think that would still be the case regardless. I think the fact that the dollar gets used is something that. So on that last analogy to El Salvador, what I'd say there, that's different than a global reserve currency. That's kind of full-fledged dollarization, and so that's a separate question. But to me, the notion that the fund would do something more to create a global reserve currency, it's not clear to me what role that would serve between what you have right now with the set of hard currencies that make up the SDR and what the SDR itself does. So I don't think that's something that is kind of first order importance to what the membership needs.
And then the second question is from Jana Morgan of Transparency International USA. Does the U.S. Department of Treasury believe that the IMF should elevate the significance of governance and anti-corruption requirements in its loan programs to a level equal to other economic reforms? How can we ensure that anti-corruption measures are not just an afterthought, but a vital and integrated part of IMF programs moving forward?
I think the short answer is we think it is a vital part. And it was one of the things I mentioned in the speech when talking about capacity development was the importance of the fund's work on anti-corruption efforts. It's something I think we see in almost every country we're involved in, that anti-corruption efforts are an important part of countries' development. So I think that is something that we would argue should be part of what the fund does, and realistically is part of what the fund is already doing. It's hard for me to say on the question of elevate to be on par with something. It would depend. I think, frankly, that's where you get into, it's going to depend on every country. For some countries, the most important reforms they're going to be doing are going to be things around the budget or around the central bank. For other countries, that might not be, the institutional structure might not be the problem. It may be more of a corruption problem or something like that, where governance is the question, not the institutional structure or the policies being put in place. So I think elevating it, I think it's really a country by country question of where is it that the most important kind of questions the fund is asking a country in terms of their reforms.
Very good. Do you have another one, or?
One last online question. From my colleague Burnett here at CGD. What about gold sales to close the PRGT subsidy gap? This could cover the entire need of the PRGT, but requires an 85% EB approval
So, we get asked that question a bunch. What I would say about gold sales is, and I should say not just that question, it's like, could we use gold sales for blank, is a question we get asked a lot. And so one of the problems there, I think, is you can't use it for everything, because there's a lot of things people put in blank in that sentence, and it can't fix everything. I think the bigger issue from our perspective on PRGT subsidy is it is not a rapid process. So moving from the decision, hey, let's sell some gold, to having money in the PRGT subsidy account is a question of years, not months. And so from our perspective, there are much easier ways to go about this. We think a transfer of internal resources is a much more direct way to do this, and a way to fill the subsidy account in the short term and make sure that we don't see a curtailment of lending out of PRGT right now, which we're really worried about happening, because the subsidy account is expensive. It is expensive to lend at zero right now, relative to what interest rates are. And so it's important to lend at zero, I think, for the countries that are borrowing at that level. So I think an immediate action of moving internal resources is a much better way to try to deal with the problem in question.
Great. Well, I'm going to, unless there's one final question, I'm going to just shift in the remaining 30 seconds to the global financial landscape, and just give you an opportunity to say, I know that as Under Secretary, you're looking at this all the time. What are the biggest risks that you see out there going forward 1 to 2 years? How do you look at the global landscape? What are you most worried about? And, which are the things that these institutions we've been talking about, the IMF and the multilateral development banks, are going to have to respond to? What's out there that you're worried about? And if there are things that you view as encouraging, say a word about those.
So
too.
I'll start with that one. And in part, I think because I started in this job almost exactly, or I started as a counselor at Treasury almost exactly a year ago. And so when I was at the annual meetings in October of last year, everybody was convinced. Global recession it's not when, is it here right now, or is it coming next month? US is going down, everybody's going down. And frankly, we kept walking around saying, really? It's not clear that has to happen. And sound policy and a little luck, that's not a given. And we haven't seen that. We've seen the US economy do much better than people were guessing a year ago. We've seen Europe come through the winter in ways that I don't think people thought they'd be able to. We've seen emerging markets show more resilience than people expected, and developing countries as well. So I think that is an important baseline. Is the global economy is not on the precipice of collapse or something necessarily at every moment. That being said, there are always downside risks, right? And as an economist or economic policymaker, you're kind of paid to think about them all the time. And so, but I always feel like that first part's important to say, right? Like, just because we think about the monsters in the closet doesn't mean the monsters in the closet are going to get you, right? Now, that being said, what do we worry about? I mean, look, the world's major central banks are trying to pull off an incredibly difficult task of bringing down inflation without slowing down growth so much that they tip over their individual economies. Having many of them trying to do that simultaneously is obviously a high wire act, right? And it's one that I think a year ago no one thought they could pull off for a year. They've obviously done it for a year. So we have said all along we think there is a path that could bring down inflation while keeping a resilient labor market. And so far we're on that path, and hopefully we can stay there. But that's obviously something that's out there. I think watching what's happening in China right now is disconcerting. The challenges in the growth model that they face, on the one hand, of not really being able to use an export-led growth model because of their size, and not being able to use a property sector-led growth model because the property sector seems to now be the problem. Like, the question becomes then, where do you drive growth? Is, I think, a real question, and just the potential financial repercussions from that. We tend to think the US is relatively, frankly, insulated on the financial sector connections, and even on the trade connections to some extent. China's an important trade partner, but less of an export market to us as a share of GDP. But it would have big impacts for many countries, especially commodity exporters and low-income countries. So I think a slowdown in China that spills over to vulnerable countries is something that we would worry about. And we're worried about debt. We need the debt treatment process to work better and faster so that countries that are at risk can get in and get out, rather than kind of sit on the sidelines wondering if they should make this leap. And so I think trying to make that process work better so we don't wind up with a large queue of countries in trouble is important as well.
Good summary. Thank you so much, Jay. Thank you, everybody, for coming. I think this has been a really valuable addition to the debate on the international financial architecture. Really glad that you're putting the IMF in the mix. And I am sure this conversation about how these institutions can respond at scale and effectively will continue. And hope that you will return at a later point to assess progress and tell us more about your vision.
Great. Thank you so much for this.
Thank you. Thank you.